Hey guys, we're going to start this video where we left off from the last one on slide 10. These are the absolute value notes. So we're going to talk a little bit about what absolute value means. So absolute value is a number's distance from zero on a number line. So remember we talked about opposites are two numbers that have the same distance, okay? So now we're talking about how far each number is from zero. So these solid straight lines on either side are called absolute value bars. So you've seen parentheses that are kind of curved on either side. These are straight lines on either side. That is called absolute value. So you want to know how far the number 3 is from 0. So the absolute value of 3 is 3 because it's 3 away from 0. So you also want to know what the absolute value of negative 3 is. Okay, so the absolute value of negative 3 is also going to be positive 3 because it's still 3 away from 0. So an absolute value will actually always be positive inside the absolute value bars. We'll talk in a second about a little different situation. So it's still 3 away because you're not talking about where the number is. You're talking about how far it is away from 0. So let's try these ones on your own and then come back and see if we got them right. So the absolute value of negative 6 is positive 6. The absolute value of 6 is 6. The absolute value of 4 is 4. The absolute value of negative 4 is also 4. Okay, so remember it's going to become positive. Where now here in this situation, it's the opposite of the absolute value. So see how there's a little opposite sign outside of it, the solid straight absolute value bars, and then the number inside of it. So you would say the opposite of the absolute value of 3. So what I always do is kind of cover up the opposite sign. Think about what's in the absolute value is the absolute value of 3 is 3. Then you do the opposite of that, which gets me negative 3. I'll explain that one more time. Inside the absolute value bars is positive 3. Then that the number 3 is 3 away from 0, so it's 3. The opposite of that is then negative 3. Same kind of situation with 2. The absolute opposite of the absolute value of 2. So the absolute value of 2 is 2, and then the opposite of that is negative 2. The opposite of the absolute value of negative 5. So we'll do the absolute value part. The absolute value of negative 5 is positive 5. Positive 5. So then the absolute or the opposite of that is back to negative 5. So why are your answers negative? Because absolute value makes it positive every time. Then the opposite is always negative. So think about it. The absolute value always gets you to a positive answer. The opposite of your positive answer always gets you back to your negative answer. So go ahead and do a little bit of practice. Some have the extra opposite sign and some don't. So go ahead and try it, pause the video, and then come back. Okay, so the absolute value of 2 is 2. The absolute value of negative 2 is 2. The opposite of the absolute value of negative 2 is negative 2 because the absolute value of negative 2 is positive 2, and then the opposite of that is negative 2. The opposite of the absolute value of 2 is also negative 2. Absolute value of 2 is positive 2. The opposite of that is negative 2. Same kind of thing over here. Absolute value of 7 is 7. Absolute value of negative 7 is 7. The opposite of the absolute value of negative 7 is negative 7. And the absolute value becomes, the negative 7 becomes positive, and then the opposite of that is negative 7. The opposite of positive 7 is negative 7. In the absolute value bars becomes positive, and the opposite of that is negative. So if there's a negative sign outside of the absolute value symbols, your answer will always be negative. Okay, because remember, inside becomes positive, and then the opposite of that will always become negative. So let's do a little talking about comparing these. So on the left side, we have the absolute value of negative 3. And on the right side, we have the opposite of the absolute value of 3. So this one is going to become the absolute value of 3. Oops, I deleted that. The absolute value of negative 3 is positive 3. the absolute value, or the opposite of the absolute value of 3 is negative 3. So if we look at those to compare them, the greater one is going to be that positive 3. So remember, the alligator kind of eats the bigger one. So the absolute value of negative 3 is greater than the opposite of the absolute value of 3. So looking down below, I'm going to delete that equal sign because these are inequality statements. So the absolute value of negative 9 is 9. We just have negative 9 on the other side. So it is going to eat the bigger one. So the absolute value of negative 9 is greater than negative 9. Okay, so go ahead and write that in. Go ahead and try these ones. We gave you the number line to kind of help you. So think about your absolute value and which ones are going to be equal to and what they're going to end up equaling. Try them and then come back and check the video. So hopefully you got that this absolute value of negative 5 becomes positive 5. So if we're writing these out in order, we would have negative 5 and then 0. And then again, we always want to write our original. So I'm going to just copy and paste it over just with those absolute value bars. So then we have negative 5, 0, and then the absolute value of negative 5. For this next one, we have the opposite of the absolute value of negative 9. So the absolute value of negative 9 is positive 9, and the opposite of that is negative 9. So remember, the farther away from 0, the smaller it is. So we're going to start with negative 10. Then we're going to have this one come in, which ends up being negative 9. And then the next one we have is positive 5. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense about absolute value. Remember, absolute value is a number's distance from 0, how far it is away from 0. And it's always going to be positive unless there's an opposite side outside of it. So go ahead and make sure your notes are all filled in, and then you can start your practice.